Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry. We'll share how a research-based approach to analytics can empower your forestry organization to make better decisions with your data. Welcome, everyone, to the podcast today. On this episode, I'd like to talk about carbon and the price of it. And so there's obviously an increasing amount of interest on the price of carbon and what landowners are expecting to enroll in carbon markets. Obviously, when we think about the carbon stored in our forests, it's quickly become one of the most talked about commodities that we think of when we talk about our forests. So in addition to harvesting timber for revenue, the emergence of forest carbon markets for natural capital systems to encourage landowners to enroll in those markets, they're all becoming more and more common. And so when we really think of it, carbon is really the currency when we're discussing trees and forests as natural climate solutions. So obviously when we think about carbon markets, there are really two kinds. We have voluntary carbon markets and we have compliance-driven carbon markets or regulatory markets. And so at least in the United States, the most common regulatory market is the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. And so this is the most common one people think about as cap and trade. And so the California Air Resources Board has had their program for over a decade now through their forest offset protocol. And so landowners can enroll their lands into the CARB's protocol and then receive payment for carbon that's stored in their woods. And so the good thing about the CARB program and regulatory programs in general is that they are primarily targeted to large landowners. And so these landowners have thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres, even hundreds of thousands of acres. And so because of that, the inventory costs to enroll properties into the CARB program are really high. And oftentimes it's over a 100-year contract length that landowners enter into. And so if we look at the price of carbon in the California Air Resources Board system, what we know is that in recent years, in particular since the pandemic has started, the price for 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide has increased. And so around the pandemic, when the pandemic started in early 2020, the price was around $17 for a metric ton in the CARB program. As early or as late as November of 2021, the prices were around $28. That was the auction price for a metric ton of carbon. And so even on the regulatory side, the price of carbon has seemed to increase as there's been more interest in natural capital markets and in forest carbon in particular. Now, on the other side, the voluntary markets have become a lot more common. A lot of startups in this world, they've expanded considerably over the last several years. And so one of the good things that these voluntary carbon markets do is that they typically have much smaller minimum acreage requirements and shorter contract lengths. And so voluntary markets could be really the best opportunity for, you think about small private landowners, people that might own 80 acres or 100 acres near the family cabin. These markets, these voluntary markets, are really providing unique ways for landowners to participate in carbon programs, which they historically haven't been able to. As one example, the NCX program is a popular one that's really increased in recent years. This is a data-driven forest carbon market, and this focuses on the harvest deferral model. And so the idea of not harvesting timber for a year and then being paid by that carbon that's been accrued over that year. That program is currently enrolling landowners across the U.S. There are lots of other voluntary programs. For example, one that's being started by the American Forestry Foundation and the Nature Conservancy is more of an incentive-based program. And that program is called the Family Forest Carbon Program. And they've recently completed a pilot in Pennsylvania and some other mid-Atlantic states. And so again, with these voluntary carbon markets, the minimum acreages are much smaller, and it often costs really little or nothing or pretty low cost to get enrolled into a voluntary carbon market. And so when you think about all of these, there's obviously increased attention in payments to landowners for carbon. But it really gets you asking, well, what price does carbon need to be to encourage landowners to enroll in these carbon markets? And so if you're going to tell a landowner you're going to get $1 an acre to participate in a carbon market, well, maybe if you're a small woodland owner, you're not even going to really bother, with the paperwork and with the process. That's just too low of an amount to maybe urge you, to nudge you to participate in the markets. But if you're going to be paid upwards of $20 an acre or $40 an acre, well, that might tend to move the needle. And so I'll review kind of some studies that have looked at this with some findings from across the forest carbon market literature. And so again, kind of thinking about this harvest deferral model and keeping that in mind. And so you might think about, well, what would a landowner want to be paid on an annual basis to store carbon in their woods? And that might defer harvest. And so maybe if those woods were ready for a timber harvest, by deferring it, you're capturing and you'd be paid for the carbon that's stored over that year. And so when we think about that, there's been a lot of literature, and I point to 5 studies in a post that I'll also link to in the notes. These 5 studies have summarized through mail surveys, through scenario analyses, the price that forest landowners are willing to accept on a per acre basis for storing their carbon. And so it might provide some insights into what does the price of carbon need to be to urge and to nudge landowners to participate. And so as an example, there was a study in Vermont by White and others in Vermont's current use program, a program for its its state forest landowners in that state. And they had, in their analysis, they said between $5 and $15 per acre, depending on conditions, would be what landowners would be willing to accept to store carbon. A study in Texas by Simpson and Lee found a bit of a higher price, so $20 to $27 on a per acre basis to store carbon. And their work really highlighted that there are differences in terms of if you wanted to install a conservation easement on your property or if you wanted to enroll in a 5-year contract. And so there are some differences there for those Texas landowners. Sean Tanger, who's a person within extension at Mississippi State University, did a scenario analysis across the southeastern U.S., and he really focused on loblolly pine as kind of the primary forest type in the southeast. And he observed that payment rates vary depending on 4 different treatments, including different ages when you thin, different ages when you final harvest. But generally, the prices that he found were between $4 and $49 per acre. So that's a pretty wide margin, but really depends on the treatments that you were looking at and how different scenarios led to different forest conditions, say at the end of a rotation of trees. Another study in Florida by Soto and others found that between $20 and $30 an acre was the amount of, or the price that landowners were willing to accept on a per acre basis. And they concluded that the amount would have been significantly stronger than if you were to pay landowners $5 or $10 an acre. And so no doubt more participation if those payments were higher to some of those Florida landowners. And then a study in the Lake States by Miller and others back in 2012 showed that between $18 and $28 per acre was what landowners were willing to accept to store carbon. And more specifically, they found that $18 an acre would generate a 50% participation rate. And so about half the landowners would participate if they received $18 per acre. And then so those higher payments were folks that really wanted some more certainty in their willingness to respond. If you were to think about something as upwards of $28 per acre. And so if you take those 5 studies, you kind of average. I mean, there are lots of ranges. A lot of them are depending on different conditions, different types of forests, different species. If you average them all, it comes out to about $21 per acre for storing carbon annually. And by no means, those 5 studies that I mentioned, are they a complete list of all of the studies on carbon? And some of them are a couple of years old, so we can think about putting them into 2021 dollars. But it could be realized and known that these are values that are almost, pretty competitive with some stumpage prices, at least for some of the lower quality wood across many regions in the U.S. We think about $20 per acre for say a low quality species. You might think of too as the stumpage rates and those different product classes that wood might go into, whether it's pulp or low quality biomass, something like that. Also need to be thinking about the management costs. And so if a landowner is going to be managing their woods and they're also going to be receiving a payment from from a carbon market, what might those trade-offs be? So are the landowners getting back their cost of management with what the price of carbon is or what they might receive? And so I think in the future it's going to be important to think about incorporating the management costs into that price of carbon. And so obviously silviculture matters and forest management matters. And so the amount that carbon payments can be flexible and take into account different types of management and silvicultural actions, I think can only bolster the certainty of some of the carbon markets that are available. And so just to wrap up, many of these carbon markets appeal to a large number of landowners now. Lots of these voluntary carbon markets are appealing to the small landowner. The current price of carbon on an annual basis is going to be a large determinant of whether or not a landowner is willing to enroll or not. And so if we think about that $21 per acre summary of at least just 5 studies from the literature in the forestry sciences, that's kind of where we're at now. And that's about just about a little bit less than the amount that the California Air Resources Board has for their auction prices, at least on the metric ton basis, back thinking about $28 back in November 2021 when they did their last auction. And so to summarize, I think as forestry professionals, as people that are analysts that are working in the carbon world, it's important to understand, to engage with landowners to help them determine if and how managing for carbon should and could be incorporated into their management plans. And so I also have a post on this idea and this summary. This was a technical release that was published through the Forest Resources Association just last year. And I'd be sure to add the link to that article down in the notes. So thanks for listening, everyone. I hope this has provided some more information about carbon and what landowners are willing to pay for it. Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com.